doesn't scream. It swallows. On a winter morning in a town that prides itself on knowing every face by first name and every dog by the sound of its bark, a boy stood barefoot on the porch, with frost biting his toes, and said there were intruders. He said he hid in the basement. He said he didn't know where his mother and sister were. He said it with the calm of a newsreader practicing into a bathroom mirror. Pine Hollow isn't a big place. Pine Hollow lives on potlucks, volunteer firemen, and the belief that horror happens out there, past the mountain ridge and the state line. But the house on Hunter's Gate was wrong the moment officers walked in. The TV was expensive and untouched. The jewelry box glowed openly on a dresser like bait nobody took. A kitchen window latch sat clean and smug, still set from the inside. The front door's strike plate had never been bothered. The thermostat was cranked to a summer afternoon, 78 degrees in the dead of January, as if the house was trying to sweat something out. Outside, the snow made a ledger of everything that tried to cross it. There were 3 signatures in that ledger. The neighbor's slippered shuffle from next door, the first officer's standard-issue boot prints, and a set of small, bare ovals that wandered into the yard and back like a guilty thought. No inbound tracks. No outbound tracks. No intruders. The wind had been steady all night, but steady wind spreads and softens prints. It does not erase what was never there. Detective Mara Ellison arrived without sirens, because noise is for peacocks, and this was a puzzle. The locals called her the metronome. The unkind said it was because she didn't blink much. The kinder said it was because she measured everything the same way, every time, step and breath, and thought evenly spaced, letting evidence find its own volume without her pushing. She walked the house once, hands in her coat pockets, eyes moving like a contractor measuring a room with mathematics you couldn't see. She didn't touch the surfaces. She didn't question the boy yet. She stood at the top of the stairs and listened to a house that had gone to war with itself and lost. Upstairs, the air was sterile hot. The bed in the master bedroom was not thrown. It was peeled back. The drawer faces were pulled but not rifled. The contents were fanned into showy messiness, the way children pretend to have eaten vegetables by scattering green beans. On the headboard, droplets arced in a repeating crescent, cast-off patterns from a right-hand swing. In the hallway, a thin lane of blood showed the stuttered, buckling path of someone small who ran and was caught. The second bedroom had sheet music on the floor, speared by a chair leg. Notes written in pencil trembled as the HVAC kicked. The song on the paper would never be finished by its owner. Ellison said nothing. She breathed in bleach that had tried to be shy but wasn't. Back downstairs, she clicked on the laundry room light. The sink's U-trap had a polite pinkness that water alone never leaves. An unremarkable hand towel lay folded as if waiting to be praised. On its edge, a line of bright was etched by something caustic, tiny, neat lines where bleach had eaten away an invisible spill. Someone had cleaned. Someone had tried to erase their hands without understanding that the past sticks to elbows, to hairline, to glasses frames. She turned her head. On a side table, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses gleamed with a sprinkle so fine it looked like dust. She didn't pick them up. She just noted where they were, how they rested as though they'd always belonged to that square of wood. The boy was 16. His name was Liam Hart. He was tall enough, but carried himself like he hadn't learned what to do with his height yet. In the living room, he sat with his feet tucked under him, as if warming them by an invisible fire. His t-shirt had freckles of brown he said came from checking on Mom and Maya. He said he couldn't find his phone last night. His phone would later be found upstairs, asleep and fully charged, dreaming on his nightstand, no more than an arm's reach from the pillow where he said he spent hours listening to burglars dismantle his life. Burglars, he repeated to the uniform with the notepad, giving the line a slightly different inflection, testing which version landed best. Detective Ellison watched the shape of the word on his lips. She nodded for him to be transported. Warmer room, statement, appropriate adult. Don't book him, she added. Not yet. She did not want a defense attorney in the middle of her first hour with the house. It took the scene text less than 20 minutes to find the gap in the kitchen knife block and the same amount of time to photograph a faint soap bead along the kitchen window latch that shouldn't have been there. Out in the garden shed, beneath a crate of potting soil and a rolled-up garden hose stiff from cold, they found an 8-inch chef's knife that had been rinsed by someone who didn't realize that the seam where blade meets handle is a tiny canyon built to keep secrets. A bag of rubber gloves sat ripped open nearby. One glove lay on the ground like a shed skin. The neighbor across the fence, a retired nurse named Evelyn Quinn, told the patrol officer that the lights had been on at 2 in the morning when she woke to feed her cat. She said she'd seen a figure cross the upstairs hallway. She said that in 30 years she had never once seen that household leave a door unlocked. She said lots of things, because people do when you give them the safe space of truth and warmth, and Detective Ellison thanked her, noting the exact phrasing, the exact times, the way Evelyn's eyes unfocused when she searched memory rather than attention. Attention lies less often than memory. But at 2, most people have nothing but the latter. Liam's father, Isaac Hart, lived 3 towns away since the divorce. He was on his way, the desk sergeant relayed, voice carved flat by the kind of news you carry often enough that it steals your tone away. The school left a message for Rachel Hart's emergency contact. The symphony camp director would later say he cried when he heard. He had been planning to tell Maya she'd received a scholarship this week. At the station, they put Liam in a family interview room painted the same beige as every family interview room in America. A guidance counselor from his high school, Nora Sanchez, agreed to sit in as an appropriate adult until his father arrived. She didn't know why her principal had called to ask such a thing on a school day when the district was 2 hours delayed for ice. She didn't know why the room was so warm. She didn't know why the boy kept asking if he could have his headphones. She sat, because she had sat with other kids who had lost other things, and because it's what you do. Detective Ellison didn't go there yet. She stayed at the house where the walls were still talking. People think forensics is magic. It is not magic. It is patience with a microscope. Dr. Annika Bose, the lead bloodstain pattern analyst, bent the upstairs light into angles. On the right side of Rachel Hart's bed, cast-off arced onto the headboard and wall in patterns that preferred a right-hander of a certain height. In the hallway, interrupted trails told a story of abrupt force and backward pull. Small hands had tried to grasp at the doorframe. A fingernail had bent and split. The print it left on paint was the size of a raindrop. In the basement, Ellison noticed what the boy's story had begged her not to. On the inside of the door that leads down, tiny rusted flicks clustered at shoulder height. DNA would later match them to Maya. If the killer had run to the basement first, how did Maya's blood end up on the inside of the door? If Liam hid downstairs, how did the basin upstairs sing of water hurriedly spun at 2-something a.m.? Ellison reached up, clicked the basement chain, and watched the bulb shudder to life. On the concrete near the utility sink, a grid of dust had been broken twice, once by bare feet, once by a damp towel, dragged lightly like an anxious eraser. She crouched. In the trap beneath the sink, a glossy film clung like the thinnest varnish. She called it out for collection, then stood and turned very slowly until the room's corners settled into the right places in her head. She knew by noon that the burglars were a ghost the boy had invented to carry his fear for him. She also knew that timing matters. You don't take a statement in the first hour. You know your suspect is likely your suspect if you can still gather a mountain that will walk on its own. You build the mountain. Then you invite the suspect to go climbing. Digital forensics walked out with 3 devices: the mother's old laptop, a family desktop in the living room, and a gaming laptop with a cracked logo and a sticker that said, "Play nice," in letters half peeled by fidgeting hands. The family desktop was boring as a middle drawer. Recipes, tax forms, an email thread about a field trip to a museum with too many rules. The mother's laptop hosted lesson plans and a list of cello pieces Maya needed to practice. The gaming laptop was a time machine. It had tried to delete portions of its own past. Computers do not forget. They only close their eyes. Hidden behind a purge of browser history were searches that felt like fingerprints. Not just morbid curiosity. Tactical. How to stage a break-in so it looks real. How long for body to cool. Difference between burglary and robbery. Best knife to. The last word was misspelled, then corrected. There were queries about juvenile sentencing in their state, about whether an inheritance passes to a minor if the surviving parent is deceased, about whether juvenile records are sealed at 18. At 11:52 p.m., the night in question, the laptop had streamed music for 17 minutes, paused, then opened a tab about how to clean blood from grout. It was still open at 12:09 a.m. Ellison asked the tech to pull the router logs. Phones traveled at night, whether their owners admitted it or not. Liam's phone had been connected to the home Wi-Fi between 1 and 3 in the morning, drifting room to room in a pattern that looked unpleasantly like a patrol route. Primary bedroom, hallway, bathroom, second bedroom, bathroom, back door, backyard, shed, back door, laundry, stairs, bedroom. At 3:14 a.m., movement stopped. At 3:18 a.m., the thermostat was raised 6 degrees. Maya's guidance counselor called the station back. She had an email from the girl, sent the previous week, asking if there was a safe way to get a lock for her door that wouldn't hurt her mom's feelings. She didn't want to make trouble, the girl had written. She was worried her brother watched her sleep. The counselor had scheduled a meeting for Monday. Monday never came. None of this was theatrical. None of it was cinematic in the way people want violent stories to be. It was quiet. It was plank after plank after plank, screwed into each other until you felt a floor under your feet that wouldn't give when you stepped on it. Ellison preferred it that way. Drama distracted. Measurement delivered. By late afternoon, the lab called to tell her what she already believed. The knife from the shed held residues from both victims. One bare fingerprint rode the underside of the handle, below the hilt where you pinch in around the tang when your grip is angry and wet. The ridge count matched a print on Liam's school portfolio, scanned years before for an art fair badge. She thanked the lab tech and said she'd bring cupcakes the next day because gratitude is a language too. They found a bag in Liam's closet as dusk pressed its palm to the windows. A t-shirt and sweatpants had been shoved into a corner behind shoeboxes, damp when placed there and dried stiff. He had scrubbed himself and scrubbed the knife, but hadn't thought to run a second wash. The fabric told a radio play of that night in rusty color and tiny sprays so fine, no eye notices them until light hits on a slant. In his desk drawer, they found a crumpled draft, a letter to his father. The kind of letter you write when your head is a narrative with one villain and one hero and no room for weather. After tonight, it said, we can be a family again. You won't have to deal with them. The letter was dated the day before. It had not been sent. On the backside, in smaller writing like a whisper, a list. 1. Wait for storm. 2. Mom first. 3. Maya quick. 4. Clean. 5. Wait 6. 9/11. When Ellison sat across from Liam that evening, his father had arrived and taken the chair beside him. Isaac Hart was a man cut into pieces by life and glued back together with determination and regrets he wore under his coat like extra shirts. He nodded to the detective, jaw jumping twice as if he were chewing a word he couldn't swallow or spit. You told officers you hid in the basement, Ellison began. She didn't say burglars. She let him bring the ghost back to life himself. Yeah, he said. I heard them. I froze. I have anxiety sometimes. Me too, she said, and it was true. Tell me about your footprints in the snow. He blinked. People don't expect questions to start sideways. I went outside to see if they were gone. Barefoot? I panicked. Tell me about the thermostat. What? It's set very high for January, she said evenly. When did you raise it? I didn't. He glanced at his father when he told that lie, then stopped glancing, because he had forgotten to hide that he looked for the nod. Isaac's hands clenched on his knees, knuckles white as snow on asphalt. Nora Sanchez watched the boy's pupils dilate every time the detective said a proper noun. Thermostat, sink, shed, router. She watched the way he inhaled when she said the word router, as if a small fishbone had caught in his throat. Detective Ellison built the mountain slowly. She didn't slam down the knife photos. She slid a copy of his Google searches across the table and let it sit within his reach, without pushing. She placed the bagged glasses, his, onto the table so gently, the plastic barely wrinkled. She spoke about the house as though it were a child, in the next room overhearing only the parts of a conversation it could survive. Rachel and Maya loved you, she said. They trusted you. Someone staged their absence of trust. That someone thought Snow would lie. Snow is honest. It recorded only 3 visitors. 1 neighbor, 1 officer, 1 boy with bare feet who went to the shed and back. He swallowed again, harder. I made a mistake, he said suddenly, and then shut his mouth, like he'd dropped a hot pan, and remembered not to pick it up. What mistake? Ellison asked. He shook his head. I want to go home. You will, she said, and he looked up sharply, hope a flicker he didn't disguise fast enough. One way or another, she finished. Isaac sagged. Nora kept her own breath steady because she had seen 20 kids lie about lesser things and had never wished so hard to hear a bad liar be bad enough to save his own life. They took a break. They always take a break. The father stepped out to the hall, leaned his head against the glass where the corridor turns, and exhaled a sound like a tired car's heater. He called no one, because he couldn't figure out who deserved to be the first to know, and because bad news is heavier when it sits in your mouth without words. Detective Ellison sat alone in the interview room for a minute with a styrofoam cup of coffee, cooling untouched, watching Liam study his own thumbnail with the seriousness of an engineer. Back at Hunter's Gate, technicians found one more thing in the shed under the plank with the loose nail, a folded index card, the edges softened by handling. The card was titled Steps, each bullet a command. Beside clean, a second line had been added in smaller script. Don't forget under the nails. It felt like a child reminding himself to take his lunchbox. Ellison logged it, photographed it with the grain of the wood, placed it in a pouch, and thought about how many steps it takes to learn a violin piece, to bake bread, to fall out of love with your mother. The lab called a second time. The sink trap sample returned positive for diluted human blood and a trace of liquid detergent with a fragrance labeled fresh linen. The towel edge's chemical bite confirmed bleach. The wire-rimmed glasses on the side table had micro spatter consistent with proximity to active stabbing. Not wipe, not contact. Mist. The kind of cloud that settles invisibly until angled light tells you it had existed at all. The digital guys paged her. They'd pulled Liam's chat thread with a friend. At 10:34 p.m., he'd typed, "After tonight, things change." His friend replied with a shrug emoji and, "Lol, what?" At 10:36, Liam wrote, "No more her." At 10:37, "Or her." Then, nothing. Like he realized himself and backed away from the cliff, or like he stared into it and liked the view. At 11:20 p.m., someone looked up how to lower heart rate quickly. At 1:12 a.m., a search, fastest way to make someone stop breathing with a knife. At 1:59, the music started. At 2:06, it stopped. At 2:07, a tab opened about staged robberies. At 2:26, the thermostat crept warmer. Ellison returned to the room with a manila folder fattened by facts. She did not swing it. She set it down flat, as if weight alone could teach truth how to stand. "Liam," she said gently, "tell me what you wanted to fix." He frowned. Automatic. "Nothing." "You wrote a plan," she said. "You told your friend the words, 'No more her.' You raised the heat. You washed in the basement, and the sink kept your secret for you until it didn't. You put a knife under potting soil because you thought soil belongs outside, and you forgot that soil holds roots. What did you want to fix?" He looked at his father again. Isaac didn't meet his eyes. He focused on the folder, the yellow, the bent corner, the way one staple in the upper left had been flattened twice and had a scar on it from pulling and redoing. "I wanted us back," Liam muttered, not quite to anyone. Before. Before what? Before she left him. He said it with a child's grievance wrapped in a man's sentence, full of debt and righteousness, borrowed from a parent too wounded to notice the loan was predatory. What did Maya do to you? Ellison asked. Nothing, he snapped, too fast. Everything, he added, smaller. She took all of Mom's time. The house was always about her. The music, the lessons, the trophies. Dad said. He clamped his mouth again. Too late. Isaac finally looked at his son. Don't, he said softly, and the softness was not protection. It was apology coming belatedly to a room that had already been furnished by other, harder forces. Ellison slid a printout of the router map across the table. Blue dots marked devices and rooms like constellations. You didn't hide, she said without heat. You patrolled. You rehearsed a lie that sounded almost good because it was boring, but the snow told me your cast list had only you in it. She paused. She let the silence widen until the room felt like it had taken a deep breath and was waiting to see if it would cry or sing. I need you to say her names, she said at last, quiet as the house had been at 2 a.m. His jaw worked. Mom, he said. Maya. The names made him look smaller, as if the syllables were stones he'd been asked to carry and couldn't. His left knee jiggled. His hands were flat on the table, palms down, fingers splayed, the right thumb pressing and releasing in a rhythm that did not belong to the music he'd played the night before. Tell me, Ellison said. He did not confess in poetry. People rarely do. He did it like a boy explaining a science fair project that didn't quite work. He had read. He had planned. He had waited for the snow because he thought snow could be his alibi and his applause. He went to his mother first because she would scream loudest. He waited by the bed until his heart slowed enough for his hand not to shake. She woke on the first strike, said his name in a way that made him madder. He went to the hallway because he heard the door click. He saw Maya look at him, mouth open, not believing the room the way it had redrawn itself around her. He grabbed her because she turned. She fought like a small wild thing you try to move out of your garage and realize belongs to the planet more than you do. He followed the lines he'd drawn in his head, and then he didn't, because reality never takes direction. He remembered to wash. He remembered the list. He remembered to wait. He did not remember remorse. He did not say sorry. He did not cry. When he was done, he seemed surprised there was no applause. He looked at the clock and asked if he could go to the bathroom. Isaac covered his face with both hands, not to hide tears, but to cover the part of the view that included the boy he had shaped by accident, with words slung on drunk nights and bitter afternoons, a mythology of blame that had felt like a vent at the time, warm air in winter, only to discover later he'd been heating the wrong room. Detective Ellison read him his rights. She didn't shoot a look across the table to see if the counselor approved. She didn't need approval. She went through the script she had said 100 times in her career, not bored by it and not hurrying it, because words like that keep the earth from tilting. Liam waved with the shrug of a teenager signing up for an app without reading terms of service. The camera caught the waiver, the nod, the slumped shoulders, the way he asked if he could get his console back from the house before the lawyers take everything. The camera caught the counselor's face when he said it, the way she tried to make her features a still lake, and failed for 1 second when shock put a ripple through. By the time night wrapped Pine Hollow in its blank quiet again, the case was not flashy so much as heavy. The DA would have charged without the confession. It was that sturdy. But the confession made it what prosecutors like to call clean. You could hold it up to light and see there were no cracks. Ellison went back to Hunter's Gate with a junior detective to run the timeline one more time from the driveway inward. She doesn't do it for the court. She does it for herself, so that if she dreams later, the dreams are in sequence and not a jumble that wakes her unsure which door leads to the kitchen. The neighbor's porch light still burned. There was a smack of cold that grabbed your sinuses and demanded to be respected. The stars had come out, and the house looked the way any house looks when its tragedy has moved from present to past, like a building. It had no grief of its own, only echoes. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the latch. Soap residue glowed faintly. She imagined the boy's hands there, how he'd polished his lie with dish liquid and hope. She walked the path to the shed and stepped into her own boot prints from earlier for no reason except to acknowledge she had been there, that bodies move and in moving, change things. A cardinal had levered itself into the hedge and gone still at her approach, as if the best camouflage is always stillness. On the ride back, the junior asked, "Do you think he'd have done it without the father's, you know?" Ellison didn't answer right away. She watched the road spool out of the headlights and measured her words the way she measured rooms. "People bring kindling to their own fires," she said finally. "Someone's bitterness can be a match. But you still have to strike it." In the morning, the town would wake to news trucks that looked like strange, tall insects. Someone would post a thread on the neighborhood forum asking how to talk to second graders about why Maya's chair was empty at school. Someone else would fight with a stranger about what we should have seen. Isaac would have to call relatives and not know where to place the commas in the sentence, "Your grandson killed your daughter." The counselor would bring donuts to her office and not eat any. The music teacher would stare at sheet music that a girl with neat handwriting had marked with little jokes only the two of them understood, and he would put his hand flat on the paper as if he could warm the joke back to life. Before the press conference, Ellison visited the lab. She brought cupcakes as promised, and stood at a stainless steel table beside Dr. Bose, peering at charts and photos. The doctor pointed with a gloved finger. Right-handed, height fits, spatter on the glasses was a gift. A gift? The junior detective asked. Dr. Bose nodded, eyes level. People forget what they carry on their faces. They think cleaning is water and soap on hands. But death gets airborne. She traced the microdots in a high-resolution image. This is a whisper. It says, "I was there when the air turned to mist." Ellison thanked her and walked the folder to the DA's office. Abigail Frost was not a hard woman, but she had a hard job, and the two are easy to confuse. She read the summary in silence, tapping once at the spot with the router map, once at the index card, once at the letter. "Charge him as an adult," she said, not because she wanted to make a point, but because the law requires you to measure intent, and the list had been a ruler. They picked the time of arrest with care. Daylight, quiet corridor, no cameras, a hallway without windows for echoes to ricochet in. Liam looked genuinely incredulous when the cuffs clicked. Shock finally touched him. When the world narrowed to the width of his wrists, he looked at his father, then the floor, then the tips of his shoes. He had not thought about his shoes until that second. He tried the sentences he'd practiced. Intruders, panic, basement. But they sounded strange in the new air, like lines from a play in a language he didn't realize he didn't speak. He asked if he could call a friend. Ellison said yes. He dialed and then hung up before it rang, not knowing what the first word should be. He asked if he could at least grab his hoodie from his mom's house. It smelled like the laundry detergent she bought, and he wanted it in the cell. Ellison said no, because kindness and order are not always the same. On the drive to the detention center, Pine Hollow rolled by in snow-bright frames. The diner where the coffee is always half good. The hardware store that sells birdseed because someone asked once in 1998. The church whose basement hosts 3 different support groups depending on which evening you arrive. Life continued in short, busy loops. The world doesn't pause for tragedy unless you are the person inside it, and even then the pause button is sticky and unreliable. There is a moment in every arrest when the thing becomes real. Not in the cuffs, not in the reading of rights, but in the clang of a door that doesn't open from your side. When it came, Liam flinched, as if the sound had pinched him. He didn't cry. He didn't speak again until the guard asked if he wanted dinner. He said he wasn't hungry, and then he asked what time lights out was, because rules give shape to an evening in a place where shape is otherwise taken from you. Detective Ellison stood in the hallway after, and wrote her report in steady lines that made a path across the page. She listed evidence. She did not list grief. She noted the confession. She did not note the way Isaac's hand shook when he signed the paper, acknowledging he had been present for it. She wrote down the times, the chain of custody, the precise names of chemicals, the serial numbers on bags. She wrote the truth in words the court would recognize. Then she closed the file, not because she was done with the case, but because she had reached the point where the case belonged to a different machine than hers. Snow doesn't scream. It holds its tongue. But before it melts, it writes in faint blue ink everything it witnessed. In Pine Hollow, a storm had recorded the footprint of a boy who wanted the story to end the way he wrote it. Instead, it ended the way the house told it, and the way a detective with a patient ear heard it. People asked later what the turning point was. They wanted one thing they could put on a poster about policing, a trick you could teach at a seminar. Was it the glasses? The index card? The router map with its firefly trail? The thermostat moved the question to a shelf with science labels? Ellison answered politely, and never gave them what they came for. Cases don't hinge on one hinge. They swing on doors with three. If there is a moment she keeps the neighbor's eyes when she said 2 a.m, with the cat in her arms and a tremor in her voice, because she wasn't sure if her noticing meant she could have prevented anything. She keeps the counselor's breath catching on the word lock. She keeps the music teacher staring at a measure marked crescendo in Maya's pencil. She keeps Isaac's quiet don't when his son started to say, Dad said, the syllables shaped like a hand reaching back through time to unsay all the nights you can't unsay. She keeps, worst of all, the hallway where a child's footprints told a story more honest than any spoken one. A story in which the villain was not a stranger, but the author. The arrest made headlines for a week. The headlines chewed their own tails and moved on. The town learned how to talk to children about the kind of darkness that fits inside ordinary rooms. The school district scheduled a training on threat assessment and early warning signs. Half the people who signed up did it because of righteousness. The other half, because quiet fear had decided to live in their homes for a while. The diner served a fundraiser breakfast where pancakes arrived chalky because the volunteers were crying. The hardware store ordered more locks. The church basement filled. The symphony camp director set a scholarship and a name he could only speak once without breaking when he stood at the microphone in the gym. Detective Ellison went back to Hunter's Gate one more time with the property manager when the tape came down, to make sure the landlord knew which repairs were cosmetic and which required a contractor with a different kind of patience. The rooms felt like rooms again. Houses are forgiving. They launder themselves slowly if you let them. She stood in the hallway between the 2 bedrooms and closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, which is the longest she ever allows herself on a scene after it is no longer a scene. Then she left, locked the door, and returned the key. Months later, when she testifies, the narrative will be clinical. She will be asked about angles and volumes and timestamps. She will say, positive for diluted blood, and consistent with right-handed swing, and router logs indicate device movement. She will show the glasses under light, the way the mist tells on itself. She will not say what the house sounds like at 2 a.m. when it holds its breath for a scream that doesn't come, because the snow swallowed it. She will not say the name of the song on the floor in Maya's room, though she remembers it. She will not say that the good people of Pine Hollow now look at their own footprints in winter and feel briefly surveilled by nature. She will say her part and step down and get a coffee and forget to drink it until it is cold, but that is later. Before the trial, there is only the work of tightening the screws on the clock you rebuilt from pieces scattered in heat and frost. The second journal they find in Liam's backpack at intake isn't needed for the arrest, but it lives in the file because this story has room for more than one blueprint. In it, on a half page, the boy wrote, "Snow erases, right?" and underlined it twice. It was a question he had put to the season and expected an answer that fit his wish. The answer sat outside on the lawn that morning, crisp and white and full of truth. Snow doesn't erase, it records. And when the sun comes out, the record runs. Ink in motion, water telling a town everything it should have seen and everything it still has time to learn.